Welcome to Meap's Hub. This is episode 1 of our Python coding series, where we'll set up VS Code for Python and write our first program. In this video, we'll cover installing VS Code, setting up Python and extensions, creating a Python file and writing code, auto-completion and error detection, Python basics, variables, comments, and more. Ready? Let's go. Before setting up Python in VS Code, let's explore other Python editors you can use, both online and downloadable. If you don't want to install anything, these online editors let you write and run Python code directly in your browser. If you prefer coding on your computer, there are several downloadable Python editors. For beginners, VS Code, Programiz, or IDLE are great options. If you're into data science, you might want to use Jupyter Notebook, Google Colab, or Spider. And for large-scale projects, PyCharm is one of the best choices. Which Python editor do you use? Comment below and let me know. First, we need to install VS Code, a powerful and lightweight code editor. Here's how to do it. To install VS Code, we first open any browser and install Python for your operating system. If you don't have Python installed, visit python.org and download the latest version for your system. Once downloaded, run the installer, and during installation, make sure to check the box that says Add Python to Path. This will allow us to use Python from the command line easily. After installing Python, let's verify the installation. Open Command Prompt. If you are using Windows or Terminal, if you are using Mac or Linux, and type Python-version. If you see the Python version displayed, you're good to go. If not, restart your system and try again. Now, we install VS Code for your operating system. Go to code.visualstudio.com and download VS Code for your system. Open the installer and follow the on-screen instructions. Run the installer, and you'll see an option to change the installation location. You can keep the default or choose a different folder. During installation, you'll see an option to create a desktop icon. Make sure to check this box if you want quick access to VS Code. Click Finish, then open VS Code. That's it. VS Code is now installed and ready to use. Next, let's set up Python. Now that we have VS Code installed, we need to set up Python so we can start coding. Let's check if Python support is already available in VS Code. Open VS Code, click on the extensions icon in the left sidebar. Under the installed section, check if Python is already listed. If it's installed, great. If not, click Install. This extension enables essential features like syntax highlighting, IntelliSense, and debugging for Python. In the extension section, you can also install support for other programming languages like JavaScript, C++, or HTML whenever needed. To do this, simply search for the language name in the extensions marketplace and click Install. Now that Python is set up in VS Code, let's move forward. Let's create our first Python file. Before writing any code, we need to select a folder where we'll store our Python files. Click on Open Folder. You'll see this option after installing the Python extension. Choose or create a folder for your Python projects. Click Select Folder and it will open in VS Code. Now that our folder is open, let's create our first Python file. On the top left, next to the folder name, click on the New File icon. Type the file name hello.py. Make sure to add .py at the end. This tells VS Code that it's a Python file. Press Enter and your new Python file is ready. Great. VS Code will underline the error and suggest adding parentheses when you run the code. This makes coding easier and helps avoid mistakes. Comments are lines in your code that Python completely ignores when running the program. They are useful for adding notes, explaining your code, or temporarily disabling certain lines of code. Python provides two ways to write comments. The first is single-line comments, which use the hash symbol. Anything written after hash on the same line is ignored by Python. For example, if I write the given code, the text after hash is a comment, and Python won't run it. Single-line comments are great for quick notes in your code. But what if we want to write a comment that spans multiple lines? Python also supports multi-line comments using triple single quotes. Here's an example. Multi-line comments are useful for adding detailed explanations at the beginning of a script or function. Now that we understand comments, let's dive deeper into variables and data types in Python. A variable is simply a way to store data, and we can assign different types of values to variables. Let's take a look at this code snippet to understand how variables work. Here, we created two variables, A and B. The variable A stores the number 5, which is an integer, while B stores the word Meap, which is a string. When we print A and B, Python outputs both values on the screen. Next, let's check their data types using the type function. This tells us the type of each variable. Since A is a number, Python identifies it as an integer, and since B is text inside quotes, Python recognizes it as a string. Now, let's see how we can assign or convert data types in Python through a process known as casting. Casting allows us to change a variable from one type to another or assign a particular type to a variable. For example, let's create a new variable C and store the number 10. But this time, we'll explicitly convert it into a floating point number using casting. Here, we use the float function to cast the integer 10 into a floating point value. Now, if we check its type using type C, we get Python confirms that C is now a float, and when we print C, it displays 10.0 instead of just 10. This is useful when you need decimal precision in calculations. Similarly, we can use other casting functions like ent to convert a float into an integer or str to turn a number into a string. By using casting, we can control how our data is stored and processed in Python. So, casting lets us manually change a variable's data type when needed. Now that we understand variables, types, and casting, let's move on. Let's talk about how Python handles strings, which are sequences of characters. In Python, you can define a string using either single quotes or double quotes, and both work the same way. Let's look at an example. Here, we have two variables, name1 and name2. The first one is assigned a string using double quotes, while the second one uses single quotes. When we print them, both display the exact same output. This means Python treats single and double quotes equally when defining strings. To confirm that they are truly identical, we can compare them using the equal to operator. This checks if both strings contain the same value. Since name1 and name2 both store hello world, Python returns true, meaning they are equal. So, which one should you use? It's a matter of preference, but many Python developers prefer double quotes. When working with text that contains single quotes avoids conflicts. Similarly, if we want to include double quotes inside a string, we can use single quotes to wrap it. This way, we don't need to use escape characters. Thus, Python allows both single and double quotes for strings, and you can choose whichever one makes your code clearer. Now that we understand how Python handles strings, let's discuss another important aspect: case sensitivity in variable names. Python is case sensitive, meaning variable names are distinct and must be used consistently. This means that name, and name are considered separate variables. Case sensitivity allows for more flexibility, but also requires careful handling to avoid errors. For example, consider the following code, which is displayed on the screen. Here, all three variables store different values, because Python treats them as unique identifiers due to case differences. If you mistakenly reference a variable with the wrong capitalization, Python will throw an error indicating that the variable is undefined. To avoid confusion, it's recommended to follow consistent naming conventions, such as using lowercase with underscores for variable names. For example, this approach improves readability and minimizes errors when working with variables in Python. Next, let's talk about variable naming rules in Python. Python has some simple but important rules for naming variables. Let's look at some examples to understand what is valid and what is not. Here are some examples of valid variable names. These variable names follow the rules correctly. Let's go over why they are valid. Username is valid because it only contains letters, numbers, and underscores. Name is valid because a variable can start with an underscore. Age is valid because it's made of only letters and does not use any special characters. Now, let's look at some invalid variable names and understand why they cause errors. Here's why these cause issues. One name is invalid because variable names cannot start with a number. Username is invalid because hyphens are not allowed in variable names. Use underscores instead. If is invalid because Python keywords like if, else, and while cannot be used as variable names. Here are the key rules for naming variables in Python. A variable must start with a letter, A to Z, or an underscore, but not a number. A variable can only contain letters, numbers, and underscores, but no spaces or special characters. A variable cannot use Python reserved keywords like if, for, while, class, etc. Following these rules ensures your Python code runs smoothly without errors. Now that we've covered the basics, it's time to test your skills. Here are 5 exercises for you to try at home. Take your time, solve them, and comment below once you're done. For the first challenge, you'll need to print your name inside a sentence. Make sure to use the print function correctly and format your text properly. Your output should look something like the format given. Give it a try and make sure your code runs without errors. Next, let's test your understanding of Python's variable naming rules. Below, you'll see a list of variable names. Some of them follow the rules correctly, while others will cause an error. Your task is to identify which variable names are correct and which ones will cause an error. Think carefully and apply what you've learned about Python's naming rules. Now, let's practice using variables and the print function. Your task is to store your favorite quote inside a variable and then print it. Make sure your sentence is formatted correctly. This exercise will help you understand how Python handles text data inside variables. Every programmer makes mistakes, but what's important is knowing how to fix them. In this exercise, I've given you a small piece of code that contains a syntax error. Your job is to identify subscribe and hit the bell icon